Hello, and welcome to How to Do Things with Words. I am going to quickly give you a kind of overview of Grice's logic and conversation as you go into next week and thinking about this piece. This article isn't too long, it's about 20 pages long, but it really is packed with a lot of ideas. And I don't think it's an understatement to say that this article really changed philosophy of language and also like philosophy in general. This really is a kind of concept. The concept of a conversational implicature is one that has been applied across many areas of philosophy since these lectures were first given in the 1960s at Harvard. So this piece comes from a book published by Grice called Studies in the Ways of Words. That book was published in the 1980s, but in fact, the lectures were given in the 1960s. Grice's lectures were another instance of the William James lectures, which the book How to Do Things with Words is based on. So these were lectures delivered at Harvard University again. I mentioned last time that the James lectures, that Kripke's Naming and Necessity, I thought was an instance of the James lectures, but that is incorrect. Kripke's Naming and Necessity, while was a series of lectures given to philosophers, it was given at Princeton and published. So it was a different lecture series. But again, these William James lectures were clearly very important. So this article, Logic and Conversation, builds in some ways on the Grice piece that we read earlier, Meaning. But in some ways, it develops new territory and does some new kinds of things there as well. I noticed that my screen cut out, so I'm going to have to restart that again. I'll just do that while I keep talking to you. So Grice in this piece is, there we go, is concerned with instances in which people may say something and mean more than the sentence that they speak itself expresses. So let's think of an example. Imagine this is Grice's example. So if we look on page 43 here, and also actually just quickly, just let me tell you a little bit about this handout. So on this handout, I've kind of divided it into different subject matters that are discussed in the article. So first of all, there's this kind of opening gambit. And as you'll notice, I put the page numbers here for where that occurs. This is the very beginning of the article, pages 41 to 43. That first bit is really looking at a kind of divergence between the way that certain logical operators function and the way in which the natural language words that they most closely correspond to function. A natural language, by the way, is a language that arises naturally amongst people. It's different from a formal language like logic or computer programming languages like C++ or Python. It's a kind of language that occurs in sort of happenstance ways. Now, Grice at the beginning of this article points to a kind of departure from some logical notions and their nearest analog in ordinary language. So think about the word or, right? Or in ordinary language has a certain function, but within logic it operates in a slightly different way. Similarly, statements like if-then function differently in logic and in language itself. If you've taken symbolic logic, this part will probably be pretty clear to you. But if not, it may give you some trouble. Essentially, Grice's piece can be seen as a way of answering this kind of puzzle of why these kinds of formal notions and ordinary language notions depart from one another. But I really think that's like a very minor part of what he's up to in this article. It's kind of surprising to me that he starts the article by talking about it, and that he also titles the article Logic and Conversation. But again, maybe this made more sense in the larger kind of lecture piece that he was giving at Harvard. So if you find trouble with this first part, again, if you've taken symbolic logic, it'll probably be clearer to you than if not. But if you do find trouble with this piece, you can skip on down to the first section, which is called implicature. And that's right here on page 43. Sorry, looks like I'm getting a little bit of lag on the iPad here. Okay, so what is an implicature? So consider the following example from Grice, and this is on page 43. So we're down here at the bottom. Suppose A and B are talking about a mutual friend, C, who is now working in a bank. A asks B how C is getting on with his job, and B replies, "Oh, quite well, I think. He likes his colleagues, and he hasn't been to prison yet." At this point, A might well inquire what B was implying, what he was suggesting, or even what he meant by saying that C has not yet been to prison. Right, so I think in this case, we can see that there are two kinds of things to distinguish. There's this idea of what is said, and Grice characterized that as being closely related to the conventional meaning of the words in the sentence, the words that he actually spoke. And then additionally, there is what is meant, right? So clearly here, the person meant something more than what is said. They probably meant what they said as well, the sentence itself, but they meant more than that. And it's not entirely clear what they meant in this case. In this case, we might need to ask them, but in an appropriate context, we might grasp what more they're trying to express in this case. Maybe they mean something like, C is the sort of person who's likely to yield to temptation, right? Or that C's colleagues are really unpleasant and treacherous people, or so forth. These are Grice's ideas, right? So essentially, a conversational implicature is something that is implicated by what is said without being explicitly said itself, okay? So Grice thinks that these conversational implicatures are a general feature of communication. I think he's right in that. It's pretty obvious that we typically mean much more than we explicitly express by means of our utterances. And a large part of the article is devoted to working out how it's the case that these implicatures arise, what makes the case that we're able to draw these inferences, and so on. And so Grice, excuse me, in laying out this view, thinks that one thing that's very important in communication is understanding communication as a cooperative act. So it's an act of doing something together. And because it's cooperative, it's guided by a kind of general cooperative principle or a rule. And that rule is make your contribution, make your conversational contribution, such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. Grice also thinks that from this cooperative principle, other specific rules follow, right? So if I'm abiding by the cooperative principle and I'm trying to make my conversational contribution, such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which I'm engaged, then I will try to satisfy various maxims. These are kind of floating in the background. They sort of follow directly from this cooperative principle, Grice thinks. So I will satisfy certain maxims of quantity. I will make my contribution as informative as is required. I'll not make my contribution more informative than is required. I will satisfy maxims of quality. I won't say what I believe to be false, and I won't say that for which I lack inadequate evidence. Or I won't say that for which I lack adequate evidence. Additionally, Grice thinks that another rule governing our action or governing our cooperative communication is the maxim of relation. What I say should be relevant to the topic of conversation. And finally, he thinks there are various maxims of manner. Like I should avoid obscurity of expression, avoid ambiguity. I should be brief and be orderly. So when one of these maxims is violated by the surface level utterance, then hearers correct for that feature and add additional implications that are, or infer that there was more information that was meant. And indeed, in Grice's view, speakers often when they speak, just rely on this kind of inferential work that hearers will do. So they assume hearers will infer that information. And so when they speak, speakers often intend to implicate more than they actually say. Some examples of this. Think about example 1 here. John ate some of the cookies, right? So this is A saying this, and B says, I figured he would. How many are left? Now, what has A said? They've said that John ate some of the cookies, but it's also true that John ate some of the cookies if John ate all of the cookies. Let me put that another way. If John ate all of the cookies, then he ate some of the cookies. So just because the person said that John ate some of the cookies, we don't know that John didn't eat all of the cookies. But speaker B or hearer B assumes that some of the cookies are left. So for some reason, because A said John ate some of the cookies, B inferred that not all of the cookies were eaten. And indeed, I think we'll find that typically we use some in this way to imply this, some but not all, even though we don't say some but not all. So in just saying John ate some of the cookies, I can express the idea that John ate some but not all of the cookies. And how do I do that? Well, because there's some additional information that's conveyed in this case. Specifically in this instance, we might think, right, so in this case, A conversationally implicates that John did not eat all of the cookies. And we know this because of B's response of how many are left, right? And I think you can think about, well, what maxim is violated here that would give rise to this implicature? And I think that essentially what's going on here is there's some sort of violation of the quantity implicature. If A says this, then they're in a position to know whether John ate just some of the cookies or all of the cookies. It would be more informative to say John ate all of the cookies. So in not saying that, they must mean to get something else across. And on Grice's picture is really trying to explain this extra kind of machinery that's operating in the background that allows speakers to imply more when they speak than what they explicitly say, and allows hearers to infer more of that information. Let's look at case 3 too. Would you like some coffee? Coffee would keep me awake. B's response in this case doesn't directly answer A's question. He doesn't say, no, I don't want any coffee, right? If B is to be understood as not opting out of the talk exchange, then B's response must, in some indirect way, be connected to the question A asks. Presumably, staying awake is an undesirable outcome for B. So by saying drinking a cup of coffee would result in it, then B seems to be implicating that she wouldn't like one, right? So I think in this case, right, maybe what's being violated is the maxim of relevance, right? Pointing out this fact about coffee and my state of awakeness doesn't answer the question. So what I've said isn't relevant, but we can easily reconstruct what's going on there as a hearer in this case and understand what the person is getting at. Now, I think it's important to notice that this depends upon context. These kind of implicatures often depend upon the specific context. B could have said the same thing they say here, coffee would keep me awake, and expressed a totally different implicature, that they want some coffee. Suppose A had said instead, you need to stay awake, and B says, coffee would keep me awake. Then, in saying that, they would imply that they want some coffee, the exact opposite. So it's not just the utterance that's doing the work, it's the utterance considered in relation to this larger context, okay? And we're going to be working out what a context is after this next week, okay? So we'll be talking about that in some more detail. So ultimately, Grice formalizes his notion of a implicature on pages 49 to 50 of this work. I'll just read what he says there. He says a man who, and sorry, he uses man throughout this, it's of its time. A man who, by saying or making as if to say that P has implicated that Q, may be said to have conversationally implicated that Q, provided that, so there are certain conditions here. First of all, he is to be presumed to be observing the conversational maxims, or at least the cooperative principle. 2, the supposition that he is aware that or thinks that Q is required in order to make his saying or making as if to say P or doing so in those terms consistent with this presumption. And 3, the speaker thinks and would expect the hearer to think that the speaker thinks that it's within the competence of the hearer to work out or grasp that the supposition mentioned in 2 is required. So you may have to work to unpack that a little bit, but I think when you get to that point in the article, you should work back and try to understand what's going on there. Grice here is, so in a sense, what Grice is suggesting is a kind of rational calculus for figuring out what people particularly mean by their utterances. Now, there's some more fine details to be worked out here, but I hope this gives you a feel for this picture. This is, again, a short article, but there's a lot going on here. It is really one of the most important articles written in the 20th century in philosophy. I think one important point is this notion of conversational versus conventional implicatures. The main point of Grice's work is to explicate the notion of a conversational implicature, but there are these other things, conventional implicatures. For conventional implicatures, the implication or what's implied by the utterance is very closely connected to the specific words that are used, okay? So consider this utterance. Mark is a philosopher, but his wife is smart, right? That seems to imply something about the intelligence of philosophers, maybe saying that they're not so bright, right? But how does it do that? Well, it seems to depend specifically on the use of this word but. From a logical point of view, but functions just like the related word and. But if we replace the word but here with the word and, we would no longer get this implication. Imagine someone saying, Mark is a philosopher and his wife is smart. That doesn't imply anything about philosophers being dumb. So it really seems to be connected to the word in this case, and that's the key thing about a conventional implicature. Grice has tests for conventional implicatures down here. So conventional implicatures are detachable. That means if we substitute in a word that has the same semantic value but is a different word, that implicature will go away, as we see with and. And additionally, they're not cancelable in the same way that conversational implicatures are, right? What does it mean to be cancelable? Well, consider the John cookie example. I can say, John ate some of the cookies. Indeed, he ate all of them, right? And cancel that implication that he ate some but not all, right? But in this case, I can't say without a little weirdness, Mark is a philosopher, but his wife is smart. Oh, don't get me wrong, philosophers are smart. That seems weird in that case. So conventional implicatures are non-cancelable, but are detachable. And conversational implicatures, on the other hand, are non-detachable, but cancelable. That means if you substitute in different words for a conversational implicature, as long as it expresses the same proposition, you're still going to get the implicated utterance there. Conversational implicatures can arise because of the specific context we're in, or they can arise in almost any context whatsoever. When they arise because of the specific context, Grice calls them particularized. When they arise in any context whatsoever, he calls them generalized. And I'll allow you to explore that more through this handout and through the reading. All right. Additionally, I want to remind you to think about the things to know handout. You're going to have a quiz coming down on that in the next week or so. I'll just quickly point out where these different kinds of concepts come from. So these two come from Grice. So you can look back at Grice 1. So that's the article meaning to get an idea of these. Constative utterances, performative utterances, nonsense, expressives, all of this stuff comes from Austin and is further explicated by Searle. And this too is developed by Austin and Searle. We talked a little bit about this in class today. And then a proposition is mainly from my notes, but also discussed somewhat by Searle. So review all of those concepts, be ready to deploy them well, and you'll do well on the quiz next week. That's it for now. Have a good weekend, and I will see you soon. Bye.